Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all, and welcome. Well, you've obviously been welcomed to Heythrop College already, but welcome again. My name is Dr. Michael Kirwan. I am the head of the Theology department here, and so that involves me teaching a number of courses in theology, including some of the basic Christian doctrine courses that you're familiar with yourselves. And what I understand myself to be talking about this afternoon, I hope you've got the same title, it's something along the lines of For Us and For Our Salvation, Pro Nobis. Oh, good. Reassuring nods there. I hope to take you through some of the themes that related to the area of salvation, soteriology. Soteriology, the Greek term for the theory of salvation, or the doctrine of salvation, and to situate that particular investigation in theology as a whole, the broad nexus of theological disciplines. And I hope that I will do the two things that I think are valuable in a lecturer. Everybody says that lecturing is one of the least efficient ways of teaching. That may or may not be true. It depends on the lecturer, I guess. But what I think a lecturer can do is, first of all, help to shape the subject for students, because there's a lot of it out there, there's a lot of books out there, and the disciplines we're looking at can be very daunting. So if the lecturer can just offer one or two guidelines or pointers, then that can be very, very helpful. And then secondly, I think really quite important, and I think it's something that happens face to face, convey a degree of enthusiasm for the discipline, because well, frankly, if the lecturer's not interested in it, then why should the students be? And I'm delighted to be sharing this particular topic because it tunes into quite a few things that are important for me personally. And if I can convey something of that, which, as I say, you can do in a face-to-face situation, then the chances are you might be enthused as well. Who knows? I hope so. Why I'm enthusiastic is because the particular well, I'm enthusiastic first of all because as a priest, the question of what theology does for us is very, very important to me. My wider perspective is what makes for human fulfillment. I'm here to generally help people towards achieving what is our destiny, our human calling. I'm helping people, myself included, to get to where we should be. And so if theology isn't making itself useful in that sense, if theology is not giving us any pointers, then for me it is a rather dry academic exercise. But there is an urgency about what we want to be looking at, a human urgency. This matters. It matters to who we are and where we are intended to be. The second reason why I'm personally quite involved in this topic is because it's a slightly different style of theology from what you are looking at when you take up, for example, Chalcedon. So the doctrine of Christology through the councils of Nicaea, Chalcedon, all these things can be pretty challenging, to say the least. You're trying to work through complex philosophical notions, and you're using Greek terms like homoousios and homoiousios and prosopon and all these things, trying to figure out what's the significance of Christ. How can we possibly hold to the view that he is somehow divine and human at the same time? That was argued about in the early church, and that's why councils were needed, because there were real differences between people. And in those days, people really took theology seriously, so there'd be punch-ups and fights and things about whether Christ was of the same substance as the Father or whether he was like the Father and all the rest of it. And so therefore, councils were required, some hard brain work was required to work out exactly what it is that Christians believe. And that's one style of theology. What we're going to be looking at today has a different tenor to it, because when we talk about salvation, I'll primarily be talking about images, metaphors, stories, because that's how we present to ourselves what it is that has been achieved in Christ. what God has achieved in Christ is only available to us by way of pictures, images. To take an obvious example, one of the earliest descriptions of salvation is in terms of Christ achieving victory. And the Latin term for this, Christus Victor. That's the title of a very famous theology book, came out in the 30s by a Swedish theologian. Christus Victor, Christ the Victor. And that's a motif that you keep coming across in the New Testament and in the early church fathers. And the most obvious, dramatic example of that, you think of the portrayals of the resurrection. And you've seen all these pictures of Jesus stepping out of the tomb. And you notice he's always waving an England flag. This is Christ's victory over death. And of course, not just over death, but over the powers of Satan, sin, everything that holds us back from God. And Paul takes up that metaphor and he says, Christ has conquered all his enemies, and the last of the enemies to be conquered is death. Death is the one thing that none of us can master or cope with. We can control disease to some extent, we can control sickness, we can be in charge of our lives to some extent, but death is the thing that always conquers. And yet, here is Christ conquering this last great enemy. And if death has been conquered, then everything else is under his thrall. And Paul, among others, pictures this. He pictures it as a victory procession. He speaks of Christ drawing everything back to the Father in a great big victory parade, in exactly the same way as great Roman generals would march their captives back to Rome in a triumphal procession. And you have the chariots, and you have all these slaves walking behind them. This is a symbol of power, a symbol of conquest. And Jesus is thought of as doing something similar, leading a great big triumph back to the Father. Or in other places, the victory motif, the victory theme, comes through as a sporting contest. Paul talks about the runner running the race, and only one person gets to the finishing line in time. Only one person gets the gold medal. And that's what we're doing. We're seeking somehow to vanquish, to overcome. It's a very powerful metaphor. You can see where it comes in. And there's lots of other variations on it. So you think of battlefield. You can think of the cosmic warfare that we find in the book of Revelation. And when Jesus is very clearly presented there as a kind of military conqueror, and Michael binding up Satan and all the rest of it. And you can get so wrapped in that kind of language that you have to stop and remind yourself, this is a metaphor, it's an image. It's a set of images, very powerful ones and very true, but they're pictures. People running races, or Jesus waving flags, or the lovely description of the Jesus, the risen Lord, harrowing hell, as it's called, the harrowing of hell, where Christ goes down into the underworld and he crashes into Satan's kingdom and he leads the people out. It's like an SAS raid, basically. It's the people, starting with Adam and Eve, they are being held captive by Satan, and Christ, on his death, goes down into the underworld. He crashes into Satan's kingdom and he pulls the captives out, just like one of these kind of Bruce Willis movies. It's a very, very powerful image for what has been achieved by God in Christ. But it's a very powerful narrative. But people are using their imagination. Now, the beauty of all of this is that nobody says that that's right or wrong. In precisely the same way that when you're doing formal Christology, people have to be very precise about their terminology and say, no, we believe that Jesus was homoousios with the Father, not homoiousios. And the little iota, the little I, makes all the difference there. With this kind of theology, it's a bit more free-floating. There are images, pictures floating around, and none of them are right or wrong, but they are more or less helpful. So if it helps you to think of Christ battering his way into Satan's kingdom and beating up the devils down there and then drawing the righteous out, if that's a help, excellent. If it is a help to think of Jesus pleading for us in a kind of legal law situation, and so you start using language of justification, and that has elements of legality, of juridical systems, the idea that we have been accused and somehow Jesus comes to our aid and enables us to be found not guilty. If it's helpful to imagine that scenario, well and good. And of course, for the reformers of the Reformation period, that was very much the key image, the image of a kind of legal system, a law court, in which we are accused and Jesus helps to get us off. If it is helpful to think of Jesus' death and resurrection as a sacrifice, well and good. But just draw to one's attention that you're using an image, because a sacrifice is a holy ritual. Sacrifice we think of as a priest offering, could be an animal, it could be plants or vegetation, whatever, but it's a ritual, it's a liturgy in which things are offered to God. And what could be less like a sacrifice than a man hanging on a cross, tortured to death? And yet we speak of it as Christ's sacrifice, the sacrifice of Calvary. And just as the justification imagery was important for the reformers, for the Protestant reformers, so the notion of sacrifice and sanctification gets taken up in Catholic tradition, above all in our understanding of the Eucharist, where the sacrifice of Christ is made present to us. But remember, sacrifice there is an image, it is a metaphor. And when I say it is an image or a metaphor, I'm not saying that it is second-rate knowledge. The point is that this is the only way we have to make these insights available to ourselves, by use of images, pictures, and so on. So it's not this kind of scientific knowledge that is real language, real knowledge, and then all this poetic stuff is kind of a second best. Science also uses metaphors. When we talk about light as being a wave or a particle, it can be both, depending on what you're trying to say. So there are certain kinds of knowledge that rely upon metaphorical language and metaphorical images and so on. And what we're dealing with in soteriology is that kind of discourse. And I like this because at base, I'm a bit of a poet, and maybe you are as well. Well, there's a bit of a poet tucked away in all of us. And I like responding to images and stories and metaphors. And I like not having to choose between them. I don't have to say, this is right and this is wrong. But they can be held together. And really, what we're trying to describe cannot be summarized in one single metaphor. We need lots of different ways of describing the wondrous things that have been achieved by God in Christ. And therefore, having a range of metaphors is very, very helpful. And as I say, when you're kind of poetic like me, it's nice to be able to do that, because my brain hurts after I do the other stuff for very long, and probably yours does as well. So the two things that I'm proposing as to how I want to frame the presentation today is why this is important, and it is important existentially because claims are being made about what is of ultimate significance to us. And this feeds back into the earlier discussions, which may be dry as dust discussions about homoousios and prosopon and persona and all the rest of it. Those matter because it's important to get this right. This is important for human destiny, for our well-being, and so on. And so there's a kind of existential engagement there. And then secondly, as I say, it's a more fluid, more poetic style of doing theology, which some people respond to more than others. And so those are the two insights that I would like to use to frame what's going to happen during the remainder of this session. Does that sound familiar to people? Is it any questions on that so far? So far, so good. Of the literature that's available, there are one or two good overviews of this theme of soteriology, and all of them would reinforce this idea that soteriology, I keep using that word, and it's like theology, if you use the words long enough, you learn what they mean. It's a bit like learning a language, so you might not be exactly clear what it means, but if you use it often enough, it sinks in. To engage with soteriology is to engage with images, metaphors, symbols, and to assess their effectiveness in conveying the truth of the gospel. So that's, as I say, that's what we kind of want to move into. And I'm going to return to that, and we're going to look at some of the key metaphors. That's right. So I was going to say some of the key texts that help you in that is I think a classic little text by Paul Fides, Past Event, Present Salvation. Very accessible book. The title is interesting because it summarizes what soteriology in a way is about. It says soteriology is about something that's happened in the past event, by which you mean the death and resurrection of Christ. And present salvation. Salvation is something that's being worked out in my life now. And that's the conundrum. How can I link what's happening in my life now to something that happened 2,000 years ago? What possible connection could there be? And yet, the Church's doctrine on salvation asserts that there is a connection, that somehow the events that took place 2,000 years ago are relevant to us now. They are they condition what happens to us in the present. So when you are cooking your Sunday lunch, it always happens when you're cooking Sunday lunch and the doorbell rings and some earnest person is doing the rounds and says, "Are you saved?" And you're never quite sure what to respond, and you can see the gravy boiling over and you have to give a quick answer. Then one possible quick answer is, well, there's loads of quick answers. You could tend to get lost. So you could say, well, actually, yes and no. Because yes, in the sense that there is a past event that is a saving event, the death and resurrection of Christ, but that is being worked out in me now. I still have to appropriate that. I have to be a part of this process and this history. And how I cooperate with this past event constitutes my present salvation. So yes, it's ongoing. I am in the process of being saved. Can I get back to my bisto now? Thank you very much and happy day to you. That's what you say to them. So Past Event, Present Salvation is by Paul Fides. Colin Gunton has written a book, this is going back a few years, but still quite good classic text, The Actuality of Atonement. The Actuality of Atonement. And then a text from a more Catholic perspective, Gerald O'Collins, Jesus Our Redeemer. That's about 3 or 4 years old, I think, whereas the others are a little bit older. All of those in different ways will take you through the different images and metaphors. And Gunton in particular suggests that there are 3 main clusters of metaphors. We're going to look at these shortly, but the 3 that he comes up with is the victory, which we mentioned, sacrifice, and justice. And then there's a 4th category, which is more kind of associated with these, the idea of participation. That sacrifice is to be described in terms of our participation in God's life. And that's a whole cluster of metaphors and images around that, about adoption, for example, or deification, and so on. But most of these authors will say there's something like 12 or 14 different metaphors, but there is a core of about 3 or 4 that have been especially tenacious, you might say, in the Christian tradition that we keep coming back to. And so when you look at a term like sacrifice, over 2,000 years it's meant so many things. And it's a term that's in crisis in many ways because people are a bit suspicious when you're being asked to make a sacrifice by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, for example. You know that there's going to be less money in your pocket. You know it's going to be painful. And perhaps people are exploiting you when they use the word sacrifice. So it's a term that has all kinds of resonances and problems associated with it, but it's still there. It's still being used in Christian discourse. What do we make of it? So we're going to run through some of the metaphors shortly. What I would like to do before that is just to reflect a little bit on that first question. I suppose there's this question of the urgency of salvation, because what's being claimed is that the material we're considering here and talking about and discussing is of vital importance to human beings. We're talking about our ultimate destiny, our ultimate fulfillment, and how best to describe that. And that raises questions, shall we say, of an anthropological nature. We're talking about who human beings are and what is God's intention for them. And that is open for discussion. There's no single account of human beings that will tell us what our ultimate goal is. Also, there is huge discussion or debate about whether we are, well, what kind of beings we are and what can be expected of us in terms of, are we any good? Are we bad? Are we some kind of mixture in between? What brings out the best in us? What brings out the worst in us? Are we pessimistic or optimistic about human beings? You might feel quite chirpy about humans one day, and then you read the local paper or you look at the evening news and you begin to wonder, well, maybe we just have to be the lucky ones who are protected from the worst excesses of what human beings can do to one another. I'd like to pose these questions and move us further into soteriology by doing a little thought experiment. And it's not me that's the originator, but the experiment originates from Karl Rahner, the great German theologian. We've come across Karl Rahner. Is he a name to people? Yep. Very fine man, one of the most impressive theologians of the last century. I find these people very daunting, so I give them little nicknames just to kind of make them more manageable. So I call him Charlie Rahner, and somehow it just seems like Charlie Rahner and Johnny von Balthasar. They somehow don't seem so threatening. But Karl Rahner, in a chapter in the Grundkurs, the Foundations of Christian Faith, which is great textbook. It's pretty daunting. It's meant to be an introduction to theology. It's pretty challenging stuff, but it is in one volume the main features of Rahner's groundbreaking theology. And there is one chapter in there where he has a meditation on the word God. It's not on God, it's on the word God. And he puts the proposition, what would happen if that word disappeared? And it's an interesting thought experiment. It says, let's imagine a situation where people are going to church less and less, they're less and less interested in God, religion is disappearing, as the secularists would like, and it disappears to such extent that people even forget what the word God means. And this takes us beyond the kind of current debates that we have about does God exist? Yes, he does. No, he doesn't. Yes, he does. The whole new atheist stuff, the Dawkins people. And as long as Dawkins is around, that word God is always going to be there. Because as soon as you say there is no God, you're hanging on to the word. What Rana wants to think about is what would happen if that word no longer had any meaning or any function. So whatever it is, 200, 300 years down the line, Catholic Church no longer exists, everybody's forgotten. What would we be like? And Rana proposes that we would no longer be human beings. We would be very clever animals, but something vital to our lives as humans would be missing. A dimension of ourselves, a very important dimension of ourselves, would have disappeared. And what it is that would have disappeared would be, he would say, and maybe this is a kind of rather German intellectual way of putting things, we would cease to have been a question to ourselves. That word God, whether you love it, whether you are frustrated or angered by it, that word God poses a question to human beings in totality. As soon as you know what the word means and you use it, then you are raising the possibility that human beings are a question to ourselves. The question of who we are and what our purpose is confronted by that little word. And whether you use the word God or Dieu or Dios or whatever, that's what that word does. So it's not a word that stands for something like a book or a chair or a table, but it is a word that poses a theological problem for us. And you're, of course, aware that Rana is very much trying to take a theological, anthropological approach to God. You remember his great achievement is to ask questions about God starting with human beings. Because he's dealing with an Enlightenment denial of God, or denial of certain kinds of questions about God. I mean, with Kant you have this strong assertion that God cannot be proved. If you cannot prove God's existence, then you cannot claim to have knowledge of God. And Rana thinks we need to take that very seriously. That's a big objection. If we cannot prove God's existence, then how can we justify belief? And the way around this, or the way he approaches it, is, well, we can't talk about God, we can talk about human beings. And if you look at human beings, you find in those human beings, if you like, a God-shaped hole. Just as you have a key and a keyhole, the keyhole tells you about the key, tells you the shape of the key and so on. So even if you can't see the key, you know that there is something that fits there. And by looking at human beings, and in particular, by looking at our capacity for love and for intellect, those are the capacity human beings have for infinite activity. There's no end to loving. Always you're drawn further and further into love. Love is never, it's not the kind of quality that you use up. If you're in love with somebody, you carry on loving them, and that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Likewise, intellect, there's no end to questions. There's no end to the searching of human beings. And the fact that we restlessly reach out in love and in intellect is what Karl Rahner thinks of as the kind of keyhole. That says something about who we are, our capacity for infinite love, our capacity for infinite knowledge. That's what makes us similar to God. So for Rahner, the famous phrase, theology is anthropology. Not so much talking about God directly, but about human beings as they stand before God. That's been a marvelous theological breakthrough which enables us to do all kinds of wonderful things. So he's a very significant theologian from that point of view, though not without problems, of course. So in the light of that, what happens when that little word God disappears? That word which symbolizes our reaching out in love and in intellect. If that's not there, then the clue to who we are has also disappeared, and we are clever, resourceful animals. Like, I don't know, chimpanzees or something like that. But there's a dimension of human beings that has disappeared. So it's a kind of interesting argument. He's trying to get beyond the arguments of whether God exists or not. He says, let's just look at that word and what that word does. Now, 200 years before Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau did something similar. And he came up with a kind of different result in a way. Rousseau, of course, one of the great Enlightenment figures, very skeptical about religion. And in his novel Emile, he does a similar kind of thought experiment to Rana. And this was a very controversial one because it involves a young boy called Emile who's growing up outside of human contact. Emile has no human contact whatsoever apart from his tutor. So there is one adult who guides him and helps him grow up. But other than that, he has no human contact, and he just lives this idyllic, paradisal, innocent existence, which is what we all, what some people like Rousseau thought was our original human condition. And he doesn't have a word for things like nature, because he's not thinking in abstract terms at all. His entire life is taken up with direct, unmediated contact with the natural world. So he's totally at home in his environment. So he doesn't have a head for words like nature, man, or God. And there comes a point when he's growing up and the tutor realizes he's going to have to explain to this lad who God is or what God is, because the lad hasn't a clue. He's never had a use for this term. And the reason why the tutor knows he has to tell him about God is because he's going to go into society. Eventually he will be going into society, he'll be at posh dinner parties and people will be talking about God, and he will not have a clue what they're talking about. So the tutor realizes reluctantly he's going to have to tell him about God, and he makes up a story about God as a kind of deist figure. But it's certainly not the Christian God that he tells him about, and it's not a very enthusiastic picture about God. This is presented as a kind of necessary evil. I'm going to have to tell him about this, otherwise he looks stupid in society. But really, the lad has no use for God, no use for the concept, and it's as if that religious dimension is a kind of appendix. I mean, literally a kind of organ that is no longer needed. It's atrophied or whatever. And of course, Rousseau got into big trouble for this with the authorities, and he was chased out of town because it's an apologia for atheism. But it's the response to Rana's question, what would happen to us? Rana is saying a dimension of our humanity would have been lost, like birds having their wings clipped or something like that. And Rousseau's answer is nothing at all would happen. The word God doesn't have any significance in human life in its ideal form, and in fact it's an intrusion. It's a distraction. We get by perfectly fine without God, without the word. So you've got two accounts there of what human beings might be like if God were not on the scene. Not just God not being on the scene, but the word not being on the scene. And incidentally, just to kind of throw in a little bit of a coda here, because it's the year of Dickens, there's that incident in Bleak House where you get precisely this incident. Joe the crossing sweeper is one of the characters in Bleak House, and he's called upon to give testimony at an inquest. And what happens is that he's called to swear upon the Bible that he will tell the truth. So help me God. And this poor lad, who's he's a street urchin basically, he doesn't know what they're talking about. He has never been introduced to the term or the reality of God. And to great perplexity, he has to stand down. He cannot give witness. And Dickens includes this little story. It's based on a true incident that he read about in the papers. In Victorian England, there was this urchin who had never heard of God. And of course, this is scandalous at a time when England was sending missionaries all over the world to preach Christianity. And of course, that's satirized in Bleak House. You have Mrs. Jellyby, this very zealous evangelical missionary. She's sending off parcels and tracts and things all over the world, and her own kids are being neglected in the meantime. It's a very satirical thing about Christianity being exported, but at home, real spiritual and physical poverty. So you have the Rousseau scenario was actually possible in England, on the streets of England, within a couple of centuries ago. And one could really think of it happening again. So two possibilities. One says, yeah, okay, that's fine. Disappearance of God, we wouldn't notice. And in fact, introducing God into the minds of children and human beings is actually a kind of distraction. It's a deviation. It's not necessary. We don't need it to lead fulfilled human lives. Rana is saying the opposite. He's saying that there is something diminished about human beings without God drawing us out of ourselves. And there's a third possibility, which I would associate with I think you could say, I don't want to be too kind of generalized about this, we could say a broadly Augustinian tradition within theology, which would draw attention, if you like, to the darker side of human potential and human capacities. The one example that I would give of this, somebody I work with, or work on rather, a great deal, the work of René Girard, who is a French cultural theorist, who's been very influential in theology and religious studies for his discussions of the relationship between religion and violence. And violence, we all know, or everybody tells us, that religion and violence are mixed in together. And Girard has a particularly interesting account of why that should be the case. And one of the things he points to is our capacity for idolatry. There's a contrast which we find in Augustine, it's there in Girard, it's there in political liberation theologies, that if you don't fix your attention on the one true God and worship God, then that capacity for worship attaches itself to something that is not God. In other words, an idol. And if you worship something that is not God, if you worship an idol, that ends up in trouble because that leads to violence. And I think that's those links are there in Augustine, in the City of God in particular. But I think they are there much closer to home. And they were there when Rana was doing his own pastoral work. During the war, he was in Vienna doing pastoral work at the same time as the Jews were being rounded up off the streets. And one of the concerns that I would have about Rana's theology is how this never comes to expression in Rana's theology. Well, maybe it is just literally unspeakable events of the Holocaust and the collapse of Christianity in Central Europe during those 12 terrible years. Theologians should be talking about that, and one of the theologians who does talk about that is Johann Baptist Metz, who's a pupil of Karl Rahner, and he takes up this theme of how Christians were seduced by this idolatrous figure of Adolf Hitler, how they were seduced by this political religion called Nazism. And their investment in that was a form of idolatry, which had, of course, catastrophic consequences. And so there's a critique, if you like, or criticism of Rahner's theology that says, well, if we get this wrong, if we don't find our way to God, we don't just revert to being clever chimpanzees. I'm afraid the sad truth is that human beings will find something to call God, usually themselves. And the consequences of that are much more dramatic and disastrous. And that needs to be factored into our theology. That's a position then that's different from the first one that says, oh, if God disappeared, we wouldn't notice. The second, the Rahnerian position would be, yeah, we'd be severely diminished as human beings. We would no longer be human. We'd be just kind of clever bipeds wandering around, but not. The third category says, no, it's not the case that human life would continue in some kind of deformed, diminished way. We would turn upon each other. We would kill each other because our thirst for the sacred, when that gets deviated or distorted, becomes destructive. And human beings make idols for themselves, and the idols, the worship of the idols, are what leads us to destruction. 3 possible accounts of what human beings are like in and outside the presence of God. And if you take the possibilities for theology, you'd want to say the first one, well, clearly that's not a route that theology can take. Christian theologians couldn't go along with what Rousseau says and all this stuff about this state of innocence, paradisal origins and so on. That's just a pipe dream, that human beings aren't like that. And certainly can't go along with his rejection of the idea that God has anything to offer us. The second 2 each have possibilities for human beings, and they've actually got their own tag. I mean, the one that Rana talks about, that God's presence adds a dimension, if you like, to human beings, it makes us human beings. You could say that's a version of what's sometimes called gratia elevans. So you have a natural state of human beings, and what God's presence does, what God's action does, it builds upon that and elevates us to a new level. So it's not that human beings are bad or corrupt or evil, but they are incomplete. And that grace, gratia, elevates us to a new level, and that's what salvation is all about. That's what soteriology is all about. The third category, which I'm associating with Augustine, Girard, all these other people, is, if you like, something in the direction of gratia sanans, grace as healing. And the primary task that God has to undertake is not one of elevating us to a new level, but of healing the brokenness of human beings. Things have gone badly wrong and need to be repaired. And God's primary action in Christ is restoring human beings after our catastrophic break with God and the consequences of that break in our communal lives. So gratia sanans, gratia elevans, the 2 kind of broad distinctions or descriptions of how God operates within human beings. I'm going to stop there and then invite some questions. So yeah?
You said there were the second and the third categories. What was the first one?
The first one is good old Johnny Jacques Rousseau. Now, since he's not offering a possibility for theology, he's basically saying God is not part of the picture. So we can reject that one because we're trying to make sense of the Christian tradition. So the first one is not one that Christian theologians can go along with, but the second 2 offer possibilities, and they throw back on yourselves to say, well, what are we? What is the human condition? Is it the state of affairs that humans are incomplete without God, and God raises us to a new level? We're basically okay, we're basically good, but God draws us up and builds upon nature. Or is it the case that human beings are radically distorted, broken, alienated, and there's a serious repair job required? And that's why Christ comes into the world. 2 sets of images or metaphors being flagged up there. And you as theologians need to, well, don't need to, but it'd be good to have some sense of which of those possibilities you're drawn to. Do you think we're basically okay and God is building upon that? Or do you think that human beings are basically corrupt and radically broken and in need of serious repair work? You don't have to answer that question, but if you want to answer it, you're very welcome. Are there any thoughts on that presentation yet?
I think I'm inclined to think that there are problems and we haven't done enough to solve them. We haven't picked up all the pieces that we should have done. If we take it in the critical sphere that you've dealt with,
Yep.
we didn't pick up the proper pieces after 1418, and we had the problems in 39 to 46.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe socially and internationally, socially I mean in the UK, and internationally, we're not God conscious in whatever religion it is. We're not God conscious enough to help to pick up the pieces for what we're leaving to another generation.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that's true, and I'll come back to that theme later on. We just think of things like the ecological inheritance that we're leading for them and so on. But yeah, I would certainly be inclined to, one of my interests is political theology and how, on the political sphere, how the gospel cashes out. And we've had a very individualized way of thinking of Christianity in many ways, and we need to somehow recover those corporate dimensions. So I'd certainly be sympathetic to that.
What's your view on those, obviously they're very different ways of looking at people. Which one would you say is the more biblical?
Ooh, that's a hugely important question. We might just have a quick stab at that and then maybe bring it up after the break. But it's about what do you think happened at the Garden of Eden, and what's that trying to tell us? Now that talks of a radical break between human beings and God. But that again gets taken up by theologians and made into perhaps something more radical than it appears. I mean, I'm coming from a Catholic tradition, so broadly speaking, I'd want to say that whatever deviations or distortions there are in our relationship with God, it's not been radically broken. I don't see original sin as giving an account of how we've been, radically separated from God. I don't think human beings are evil. God doesn't create rubbish, basically. So there's a sense in which I'm drawn to that gratia elevans. On the other hand, you look at the newspapers and you read of the things that are happening and the way human beings can behave towards one another, and thinking, my God, I wish I was a snail or something. You're just ashamed of your species sometimes. So there's evidence of either way, I think.
The image of God left there, is what you're saying.
It's yes, so I think very much so. Yes, I'd be broad. Sometimes someone like Rana is seen as a kind of optimistic thinker, and he doesn't have enough to say about sin or about evil and so on. Now you can argue the case, and you need to read him and see whether it makes sense. But I think there is an issue there about the fact that the entirety of his writings, there's nothing on the Second World War, and same with Balthasar. I mean, Balthasar has this great mythology of the descent into hell, and maybe that's his way of talking about Auschwitz and Treblinka and so on. But he mythologizes it in a way. But it's just odd that you have this generation of German thinkers living through this stuff and not writing or reflecting upon it. And Johann Baptist Metz was the next generation down and said, what's going on? We need to talk about this. We need to write about it. We need to face the Jews after Auschwitz. And so the whole theological agenda opens up there.